On April 19, 1945, at approximately 1400 hours, Soviet forces finally broke through German defensive lines at Seelow Heights and began advancing toward Berlin. The battle had lasted 3 days and had cost 80,000 German casualties and over 110,000 Soviet casualties. It was the last major pitched battle of World War II in Europe. 11 days later, Adolf Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery. The Battle of Seelow Heights was Germany's final attempt to stop the Soviet advance on Berlin, fought by a desperate mixture of exhausted Wehrmacht veterans, fanatical Hitler Youth teenagers, and elderly Volkssturm Home Guard against the most powerful military force ever assembled. Over 1 million Soviet troops supported by 2,500 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces. This is the story of the final battle for Berlin, the largest artillery barrage in history and Germany's last stand before the fall of the Third Reich. To understand the Battle of Seelow Heights, we must begin with the strategic situation in April 1945. By early April, the Third Reich was collapsing. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into Western Germany. Soviet forces had liberated Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and most of Austria. The Red Army stood approximately 60 kilometers east of Berlin along the Oder River. Germany had lost the war, and every informed person knew it. The only question was how much longer fighting would continue and how many more would die before Germany surrendered. Soviet command planned massive final offensive to capture Berlin and end the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding 1st Belorussian Front, would attack directly toward Berlin from bridgeheads across the Oder River. Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding 1st Ukrainian Front, would attack from south of Berlin, encircling the city from that direction. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding 2nd Belarusian Front, would attack north of Berlin, preventing German forces from retreating northward. The three fronts combined fielded over 2.5 million troops, 6,000 tanks and assault guns, and 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars. This was overwhelming force intended to crush remaining German resistance quickly. However, between Soviet forces and Berlin lay the Seelow Heights, a ridge of hills approximately 40 to 60 meters higher than surrounding terrain. The Seelow Heights ran roughly north-south, about 15 kilometers west of the Oder River. German forces occupying the heights had excellent observation over the flat terrain to the east, where Soviet forces would have to advance. German artillery positioned on the heights could fire down on attacking Soviet forces with devastating effect. The Seelow Heights was natural defensive position, and German command intended to use every advantage it provided. German Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Busse, defended the Seelow Heights sector. Ninth Army consisted of approximately 100,000 troops, organized into 11 divisions of various types. However, these divisions bore little resemblance to German divisions of earlier war years. German divisions in April 1945 were shadows of their former strength, typically fielding 5,000 to 7,000 troops, instead of full strength of 12,000 to 15,000. Equipment was limited, with many units lacking adequate artillery, anti-tank weapons, and armor support. Ammunition stocks were low and could not be replenished because German logistics had collapsed. Most critically, German Ninth Army's personnel reflected desperation of Germany's strategic situation. The army included veterans of Eastern Front fighting who had survived years of brutal combat and possessed considerable tactical skill and experience. However, these veterans were exhausted, demoralized by continuous retreats, and knew the war was lost. Alongside veterans were Hitler Youth members, teenagers as young as 15, who had been conscripted into military service in final months of war. These boys were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and willing to fight, but they lacked training and experience. Also present were Volkssturm units consisting of men too old or unfit for regular military service, armed with outdated weapons and minimal training. This mixture of exhausted veterans, fanatical teenagers, and inadequately trained older men would face the most powerful army in Europe. Commanding German defenses in the sector was General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Wehrmacht's most capable defensive commanders. Heinrici had earned reputation on Eastern Front for conducting skilled defensive operations against superior Soviet forces. Heinrici understood that his forces could not stop Soviet offensive, but believed he could delay it significantly and inflict maximum casualties. Heinrici's defensive plan emphasized depth, with multiple defensive lines so that breakthrough of forward positions would not mean collapse of entire defense. Heinrici also positioned reserves carefully to counterattack Soviet breakthroughs and maintain defensive cohesion as long as possible. Heinrici's defensive preparations made maximum use of Seelow Heights' natural advantages. German forces constructed extensive trench systems, bunkers, and fighting positions along the heights and on approaches to it. Anti-tank ditches were dug across likely Soviet advance routes. Villages were fortified and prepared for defense. German artillery, though limited in numbers compared to Soviet guns, was positioned to fire on predetermined killing zones where Soviet forces would be most vulnerable. Heinrici also flooded areas along Oder River by opening dams and breaking dikes, creating marshes and water obstacles that would slow Soviet advance. German defenders knew they were fighting for survival. Propaganda from both Nazi officials and Soviet sources had convinced many German soldiers that Soviet victory meant death or slavery. This belief, combined with discipline, loyalty to comrades, and in some cases fanatical Nazi ideology, motivated German forces to fight desperately despite hopeless situation. German officers and NCOs maintained discipline and tactical competence even as strategic situation deteriorated. German soldiers in April 1945 were fighting not for Hitler or Nazi ideology, but for survival and to protect Germany from what they believed would be terrible retribution. Marshal Zhukov's First Belorussian Front assembled overwhelming force to break through German defenses. First Belorussian Front consisted of approximately 1 million troops organized into 9 armies, including 2 tank armies. Supporting this force were 2,500 tanks and assault guns, 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 7,500 aircraft. Soviet logistics had delivered enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, and supplies to forward positions. Soviet forces were well fed, adequately equipped, and confident of victory. Soviet morale was excellent. Soldiers knew the war was almost won, and that Berlin, the ultimate objective, was within reach. Zhukov planned to begin offensive with massive artillery barrage that would destroy German defensive positions and demoralize defenders. Soviet artillery would fire for 30 minutes at maximum intensity, saturating German positions with high explosive and shrapnel. Immediately after barrage ended, Soviet infantry and tanks would advance across Oder River and Seelow Escarpment toward Berlin. Zhukov expected to break through German defenses on first day and reach Berlin suburbs within days. Stalin had encouraged competition between Zhukov and Konev over who would capture Berlin first, creating pressure on Zhukov to achieve rapid breakthrough. Zhukov also planned unusual tactic to support the offensive: searchlights. Soviet forces would employ 143 searchlights positioned behind assault forces. When offensive began, searchlights would illuminate battlefield, supposedly blinding German defenders and allowing Soviet forces to advance more easily in darkness. This tactic had been used successfully in smaller operations earlier in war, and Zhukov believed it would prove decisive at Seelow Heights. However, the searchlight plan would backfire catastrophically. At precisely 0300 hours on April 16, 1945, 40,000 Soviet artillery pieces, multiple rocket launchers, and heavy mortars opened fire simultaneously along entire front-facing Seelow Heights. The barrage was largest artillery bombardment in history, exceeding even massive bombardments at Verdun during World War I or Kursk during Operation Citadel. Sound of 40,000 guns firing was audible over 100 kilometers away. Ground shook continuously. Bright flashes of exploding shells created artificial dawn. German positions were saturated with explosive, with shells falling at rates of dozens per minute on every square meter of defensive positions. German defenders who survived initial barrage described it as hell beyond description. Trenches collapsed from concussion. Bunkers shook and threatened to collapse. Men went deaf from continuous explosions. Some went mad from the experience. Communication lines were cut immediately. Command posts were destroyed. Casualties mounted from direct hits and from collapsing fortifications. However, Heinrici's defensive dispositions minimized effectiveness of Soviet barrage. Heinrici had positioned only minimal forces in forward trenches, keeping main defensive forces back from areas where Soviet artillery would concentrate fire. This meant Soviet barrage, while terrifying, killed fewer German defenders than Zhukov expected. At 03:30, 30 minutes after barrage began, Soviet searchlights were switched on. 143 powerful searchlights, each capable of illuminating targets several kilometers away, lit up simultaneously. The intention was to blind German defenders while Soviet forces advanced in illuminated battlefield. However, the searchlights backfired completely. Smoke and dust from artillery barrage hung thick in the air. Searchlight beams reflected off this smoke, creating impenetrable white glare that blinded Soviet attackers rather than German defenders. Soviet troops advancing toward German lines could not see where they were going. Tank crews were effectively blind. Soviet forces became disoriented and confused in the unnatural lighting conditions. At 0400 hours, Soviet infantry and tanks began advancing toward German lines. 8th Guards Army and 5th Shock Army, supported by 1st Guards Tank Army, advanced from Oder River bridgeheads toward Seelow Heights. Immediately, Soviet forces encountered problems. Searchlights had created visibility nightmare. Flooded ground slowed advance. German forces positioned on heights and in depth opened fire on advancing Soviet forces. German machine guns, artillery and anti-tank weapons fired from prepared positions at Soviet troops struggling through difficult terrain in poor visibility. Soviet casualties began mounting immediately. Soviet tactics emphasized overwhelming German defenses through sheer mass. Multiple waves of Soviet infantry advanced continuously, accepting heavy casualties to close with German positions. When first wave was stopped, second wave advanced over their bodies. Soviet tanks drove forward even when infantry support was pinned down. Soviet artillery continued firing even as Soviet infantry advanced, accepting risk of friendly fire casualties to maintain pressure on German defenders. These were brutal but effective tactics that had worked in previous Soviet offensives. However, at Seelow Heights, German defensive advantages and Soviet visibility problems reduced effectiveness. By midday, April 16th, Soviet forces had advanced only several kilometers and had not broken through main German defensive line on Seelow Heights. Casualties were much higher than expected. 1st Guards Tank Army, intended to be exploitation force that would drive toward Berlin after breakthrough, was committed prematurely to support stalled infantry advance. Tank losses mounted as German anti-tank weapons destroyed Soviet armor, attempting to advance up slopes toward German positions. Zhukov was furious at slow progress and ordered attacks to continue regardless of casualties. German defenses, while under enormous pressure, held through April 16th. Heinrici's defensive planning had worked better than anyone expected. Multiple defensive lines meant that when Soviet forces overran forward positions, they immediately faced additional prepared positions further back. German artillery, though heavily outnumbered, concentrated fire effectively on Soviet assembly areas and advance routes. German infantry fought stubbornly from prepared positions, making Soviet forces pay in blood for every meter of advance. German tactical skill and determination compensated partially for overwhelming Soviet numerical and material superiority. However, German situation was unsustainable. Ammunition stocks were depleting rapidly. German forces had limited ability to replace casualties, while Soviet forces had apparently unlimited reserves. German reinforcements were not available because all strategic reserves had been committed to other sectors or had been destroyed. German defensive success on April 16th was buying time at terrible cost, but time was running out. On April 17th, Soviet attacks continued with same overwhelming force as previous day. Zhukov committed additional armies to breakthrough effort. 3rd Shock Army and 3rd Army entered battle, adding hundreds of thousands more troops to assault. Soviet tactics remained unchanged. Mass attacks accepting heavy casualties to overwhelm German defenses through attrition. Soviet artillery maintained continuous fire, expending ammunition at rates that would have been impossible for any other army. Soviet aircraft dominated skies, attacking German positions with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. German defenses began cracking under relentless pressure. Ammunition shortages became critical. German units reported they were down to final reserves of artillery shells and anti-tank rounds. Some units were ordered to fire only when absolutely necessary to conserve ammunition. German casualties continued mounting. Hitler Youth units suffered especially heavy losses due to their inexperience and tendency to counterattack when surrounded rather than retreating. Veteran German units fought more skillfully, but even veterans could not hold indefinitely against such overwhelming odds. By evening, April 17th, Soviet forces had fought their way onto Seelow Heights at several points, but had not achieved decisive breakthrough. German forces still held substantial positions on heights and continued inflicting heavy casualties on attacking Soviet forces. However, German defensive cohesion was degrading. Units were becoming isolated as Soviet forces infiltrated gaps between defensive positions. Communication between units had broken down, some units had lost all their officers and were being commanded by sergeants or even privates. German Ninth Army was disintegrating but still fighting. April 18th saw continued brutal combat as Soviet forces ground forward meter by meter against desperate German resistance. Soviet casualties for three-day battle now exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded, far higher than Zhukov had anticipated. Stalin was becoming concerned about slow progress and questioned whether Zhukov could break through at all. Zhukov responded by committing final reserves and ordering attacks to continue day and night without pause. Soviet forces would win through exhaustion if necessary, by attacking continuously until German forces physically could not fight anymore. German situation on April 18th was catastrophic. Ammunition was almost completely exhausted. Many artillery batteries had fired their last shells. Anti-tank weapons lacked ammunition to engage Soviet armor effectively. German infantry was down to small arms fire and grenades. Food and water were scarce. Medical supplies were exhausted and wounded could not be evacuated because roads were under continuous Soviet artillery fire. German forces were reduced to fighting with whatever weapons and ammunition remained, knowing that reinforcement and resupply were impossible. General Heinrici recognized that Ninth Army could not hold much longer and recommended withdrawal to defensive positions closer to Berlin. Hitler refused authorization for withdrawal, ordering Ninth Army to hold regardless of cost. Hitler still believed that holding Oder Line would somehow allow time for miracle weapons or political negotiations to save Third Reich. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal, when withdrawal was only rational military decision, demonstrated his complete detachment from reality in final days of war. On April 19th, German defenses at Seelow Heights finally collapsed. Soviet forces broke through at multiple points, and German units began retreating toward Berlin in disorder. Some units conducted fighting withdrawals, maintaining cohesion and continuing to resist. Other units disintegrated completely, with soldiers fleeing individually or in small groups. Zhukov finally had his breakthrough 3 days later than planned and at much higher cost than anticipated. But the road to Berlin was open. The casualties at Seelow Heights reflected brutal nature of final battles on Eastern Front. German Ninth Army suffered approximately 80,000 casualties out of 100,000 troops committed, effectively destroying the army as fighting force. Soviet First Belorussian Front suffered approximately 30,000 killed and 80,000 wounded out of 1 million troops committed. Additionally, thousands of Soviet tanks and other armored vehicles were destroyed or damaged. Both sides paid terrible price for ground that had no strategic value except as approach to Berlin. Individual experiences from Seelow Heights battle provide human perspective on statistics. German soldier accounts describe fighting under constant artillery bombardment, seeing comrades killed by shell fire, running out of ammunition and being unable to respond to Soviet attacks, and finally receiving orders to retreat when retreat was almost impossible. Hitler Youth members who survived described their horror at combat's reality after months of propaganda about heroic defense. Oder Volkssturm soldiers described feeling abandoned by Nazi leadership that sent them into battle inadequately armed and trained. Soviet soldier accounts describe advancing through concentrated German fire, stepping over bodies of comrades killed in previous attacks, reaching German trenches only to face determined defenders fighting hand-to-hand, and feeling that progress was impossibly slow, despite overwhelming superiority. Soviet tank crews described attempting to advance up Seelow escarpment under German anti-tank fire, watching tanks around them explode, and difficulty operating in terrain that favored defenders. Soviet artillery crews described firing continuously for days, working until physically exhausted and seeing endless convoys bringing forward more ammunition. The tactical lessons from Seelow Heights were significant. Defense in depth, with multiple prepared positions, remained extremely effective even against overwhelming attacking force. Defender advantage of high ground was demonstrated again as German forces on Seelow Heights inflicted casualties far exceeding what their numbers should have allowed. However, Seelow Heights also demonstrated that no defensive position, however strong, could hold indefinitely against attacker with massive material superiority and willingness to accept heavy casualties. Soviet victory was achieved through combination of overwhelming force and acceptance of casualties that would have been politically unacceptable to Western armies. The searchlight tactic failure at Seelow Heights became one of battle's memorable aspects. Zhukov's plan to use searchlights to blind German defenders backfired when smoke and dust reflected light back at Soviet forces. This failure demonstrated dangers of attempting novel tactics without adequate testing. Searchlight tactic had worked in smaller operations against unprepared defenders, but at Seelow Heights conditions were different, and tactic became liability rather than asset. Soviet forces eventually turned off most searchlights after realizing they were causing more problems than solving. The Battle of Seelow Heights marked end of major conventional warfare on Eastern Front. After Seelow Heights, remaining German forces could only conduct delaying actions as they retreated toward Berlin and conducted final defense of capital itself. Battle of Berlin, which began immediately after Seelow Heights' breakthrough, was urban combat rather than open field battle. Seelow Heights was last time Wehrmacht fielded army-level force in defensive positions, attempting to stop Soviet advance in conventional engagement. Adolf Hitler's reaction to Seelow Heights battle demonstrated his complete detachment from reality in final days. Despite devastating defeat and destruction of Ninth Army, Hitler continued issuing orders based on assumption that non-existent reserves could be committed and that German forces could somehow stop Soviet advance. Hitler blamed generals for defeat, relieving commanders and issuing contradictory orders that could not be executed. Hitler's behavior during and after Seelow Heights reflected psychological breakdown of man facing imminent defeat and death. For German soldiers fighting at Seelow Heights, battle represented end of any hope that Germany could avoid defeat. Professional soldiers who had survived years of Eastern Front combat recognized that holding Oder Line was final realistic defensive position, and its loss meant nothing stood between Soviet forces and Berlin. Hitler Youth and true believers might still believe in final victory through miracle weapons or willingness to fight to death, but experienced soldiers knew the war was over. Seelow Heights was fighting for survival and to delay inevitable, not fighting for victory. For Soviet forces, Seelow Heights represented final major obstacle before capturing Berlin and ending European war. Soviet soldiers were motivated by knowledge that victory was near and that Berlin, ultimate symbol of Nazi Germany, was within reach. However, Soviet casualties at Seelow Heights were a sobering reminder that German forces, even in defeat, could still inflict terrible losses. Soviet willingness to accept such casualties reflected both military calculation that losses were acceptable to achieve rapid victory and political pressure from Stalin to capture Berlin quickly before Western allies could intervene. The political dimensions of Seelow Heights battle extended beyond immediate military situation. Stalin wanted Soviet forces to capture Berlin before Western allies could reach it, ensuring Soviet Union's dominant position in post-war negotiations. This political pressure contributed to Zhukov's aggressive tactics and willingness to accept heavy casualties. Western allies, meanwhile, had deliberately slowed their advance toward Berlin, believing that capturing Berlin would cost heavy casualties and that city would fall within Soviet occupation zone anyway, according to agreed post-war divisions of Germany. This allowed Soviet forces to focus entirely on Berlin without concern about Western competition. The aftermath of Seelow Heights saw Soviet forces beginning Battle of Berlin on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. Soviet forces encircled Berlin from multiple directions and began urban combat that would continue until May 2nd. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 11 days after Seelow Heights breakthrough. German garrison in Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. Seelow Heights battle, occurring April 16th through 19th, was therefore only 2 weeks before war's end, making it truly final major battle of European war. The cost of Seelow Heights in German lives was particularly tragic because battle occurred so close to war's end. 80,000 German casualties defending position that could only delay inevitable by days represented waste of lives that achieved nothing strategically. Young Hitler youth killed at Seelow Heights died for regime that was already collapsing and ideology that would be utterly discredited within weeks. Oder Volkssturm members died defending government that had led Germany to ruin. Even Wehrmacht veterans who fought skillfully at Seelow Heights died accomplishing nothing except slightly delaying Soviet capture of Berlin. Soviet casualties at Seelow Heights, while justified by quick victory and rapid end to war, were nevertheless sobering. Over 100,000 Soviet casualties in three-day battle demonstrated that even victorious army pays terrible price in final battles. Soviet families who lost sons, husbands, and fathers in final weeks of war suffered same grief as families who lost loved ones earlier. Soviet wounded from Seelow Heights carried physical and psychological scars for remainder of their lives. Victory, while deserved and celebrated, came at price that should be remembered. The memory of Seelow Heights in Soviet and later Russian consciousness is overshadowed by Battle of Berlin that followed. While Kursk, Stalingrad, and Moscow are commemorated as great victories, Seelow Heights is less well known despite being final major battle. Soviet propaganda emphasized Berlin capture rather than preparatory battle at Seelow Heights. Modern Russian memory of Great Patriotic War focuses on earlier defensive victories and Berlin capture, with Seelow Heights receiving less attention. In German memory, Seelow Heights represents end of illusions about defending Third Reich. German veterans who survived Seelow Heights and later wrote memoirs described it as a moment when even most optimistic realized war was truly lost, and that Germany would be occupied and divided. Seelow Heights marked transition from fighting for Germany to fighting for personal survival. German historical understanding of Seelow Heights emphasizes waste of lives in defense of regime that was morally bankrupt and militarily defeated. The Battle of Seelow Heights demonstrates several enduring military principles. Defense of high ground provides significant tactical advantages even against numerically and materially superior attacker. Combined arms operations integrating infantry, armor, and artillery are essential for success in modern warfare. Logistics and ammunition supply determine how long forces can sustain combat. Morale and training matter enormously. Well-trained, experienced troops can achieve results far beyond what their numbers suggest. However, no amount of skill, determination, or tactical advantage can overcome overwhelming material superiority indefinitely. The 40,000 guns that fired at Seelow Heights represented industrial capacity that Germany could not match. Soviet Union, despite suffering tremendous damage during German invasion, rebuilt its industrial capacity and increased military production to levels that exceeded German production, despite Germany controlling much of Europe. Soviet ability to concentrate such massive artillery force at single point demonstrated both industrial capacity and logistical capability to move and supply such forces. Germany, by April 1945, lacked industrial capacity to replace losses and logistical capability to supply forces adequately. Today, Seelow Heights battlefield is preserved as memorial and historical site. Museum in Seelow displays artifacts from battle and provides historical information about engagement. Monuments commemorate both Soviet soldiers who attacked and German soldiers who defended. Battlefield itself shows scars of combat, shell craters, remnants of trenches, and areas where forests have not fully regrown. Visitors can walk terrain and understand how topography influenced battle. Memorial helps ensure that battle's lessons and sacrifices are not forgotten. The Battle of Seelow Heights stands as final major conventional engagement of World War II in Europe. 40,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 tanks, over 1 million Soviet troops against 100,000 German defenders in 3 days of brutal combat. German last stand failed, road to Berlin opened, Third Reich's final days began. 11 days later, Hitler would be dead. 23 days later, war in Europe would end. Seelow Heights was where Nazi Germany's defeat became inevitable, where final barrier to Berlin fell, where determined but doomed German resistance was overwhelmed by Soviet force. The soldiers who fought and died at Seelow Heights in final weeks of war deserve remembrance for their sacrifice, regardless of which side they fought for. Their battle helped end history's most destructive war and determined that Europe would be rebuilt from ashes of Third Reich. The legacy of Seelow Heights is that even at war's end, victory required enormous sacrifice, and peace was purchased at terrible price in blood and suffering. That price should never be forgotten. The specific tactical details of Seelow Heights battle reveal complexity beneath strategic narrative. Soviet forces established bridgeheads across Oder River in February and March 1945, expanding them gradually despite German counterattacks. These bridgeheads provided assembly areas for Soviet forces preparing for final offensive. German forces conducted continuous raids and artillery strikes, attempting to disrupt Soviet preparations, but lacked strength to eliminate bridgeheads entirely. Soviet engineers constructed bridges and ferries to support offensive, building duplicate structures so that destruction of some bridges would not halt offensive completely. Soviet artillery preparation for Seelow Heights offensive was unprecedented in scale and planning. 40,000 guns, howitzers, mortars, and rocket launchers were positioned in carefully calculated firing positions. Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized concentration of fire on specific targets rather than dispersing fire across wide area. Soviet gunners had detailed firing plans specifying which units would fire at which targets during each phase of barrage. Ammunition was stockpiled at forward positions in quantities that seemed impossible. Millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of rockets. Soviet logistics personnel had worked for weeks moving ammunition forward, accepting that roads and railways were clogged with supply convoys, but ensuring that artillery would not run out of ammunition during critical hours. German defensive preparations were equally sophisticated despite limited resources. General Heinrici personally inspected defensive positions and ordered adjustments based on his assessment of Soviet likely attack routes. German engineers strengthened existing fortifications and constructed new ones. Anti-tank ditches were dug where terrain channeled Soviet armor into predictable routes. Minefields were laid with careful attention to covering approaches to key positions. German forces had limited mines available, so minefield placement had to be optimized for maximum effect. German artillery firing positions were selected to provide interlocking fields of fire and to have alternate positions available when Soviet counter-battery fire targeted primary positions. The Hitler Youth units fighting at Seelow Heights represented tragedy of Nazi Germany's final months. These teenagers, some barely 15 years old, had been indoctrinated throughout their lives with Nazi ideology. They believed in German superiority and were convinced that fighting to the death was both duty and honor. However, their training was minimal, often only weeks, and their equipment was inadequate. Many Hitler Youth soldiers carried outdated rifles with limited ammunition. Some were armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and sent against Soviet tanks with minimal instruction on how to use them effectively. Despite their enthusiasm and willingness to die for Germany, Hitler Youth units suffered catastrophic casualties due to inexperience and tendency to make brave but tactically foolish decisions. The Volkssturm units at Seelow Heights represented different tragedy. These older men, many in their 50s and 60s, had been conscripted in final desperate mobilization. Many were World War I veterans who had thought their combat days were over. They understood military realities better than Hitler Youth and recognized that Germany had lost the war. However, they fought because desertion meant execution and because protecting their families and communities required delaying Soviet advance as long as possible. Volkssturm units were poorly armed, often with captured weapons of various nationalities that required different ammunition types, creating logistical nightmares. Volkssturm training was minimal, sometimes only days. Many Volkssturm soldiers died in first hours of Soviet offensive, cut down by artillery or machine gun fire before they could even engage enemy. Wehrmacht veterans at Seelow Heights provided German defense's only real military effectiveness. These soldiers had survived years of Eastern Front fighting. They knew Soviet tactics intimately and how to fight effectively against superior numbers. Veterans understood value of prepared positions, importance of conserving ammunition, and necessity of withdrawing when position became untenable rather than dying uselessly. However, veterans were physically and mentally exhausted. Years of continuous combat, repeated retreats, watching Germany lose the war, and knowledge that defeat was inevitable had destroyed morale of even elite units. Veterans fought at Seelow Heights with professional competence, but without hope or enthusiasm, knowing they were buying days at most, and that their sacrifice would not change war's outcome. Soviet infantry tactics at Seelow Heights reflected evolution of Red Army from 1941 disasters to 1945 proficiency. Soviet infantry no longer attacked in simple human waves, easily mowed down by German machine guns. Soviet assault tactics now emphasized combined arms coordination with infantry advancing under cover of artillery fire and supported by tanks and assault guns. Soviet infantry used terrain effectively, taking advantage of shell craters, ditches, and ruined buildings for cover. Soviet junior officers and NCOs showed initiative and tactical skill that early war Red Army had lacked. However, Soviet tactics still accepted casualty rates that Western armies would have considered unacceptable. Soviet commanders ordered attacks to continue, despite losses, because overwhelming force and replacement availability made losses acceptable if objectives were achieved. Soviet tank operations at Seelow Heights demonstrated both strengths and limitations of Soviet armored forces. Soviet tanks, primarily T-34-85 medium tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks, were technically superior to most German tanks remaining in service. Soviet tank crews had years of combat experience and understood their vehicles' capabilities and limitations. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized mass and momentum, with tank formations attacking in concentrated groups that overwhelmed German defensive positions through firepower and numbers. However, Soviet tanks at Seelow Heights struggled with terrain that favored defenders. Advancing upslope toward German positions meant exposing vulnerable bottom armor to German anti-tank fire. Flooded ground and obstacles slowed tank advance and channeled tanks into kill zones. German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, while short-range, were devastating in close combat and inflicted significant tank losses when German infantry could get close enough to use them. The medical situation at Seelow Heights was catastrophic for both sides. Soviet medical services were overwhelmed by casualty flow despite extensive preparation. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid evacuation of wounded from front lines to field hospitals. But at Seelow Heights, evacuation was often impossible due to continuing combat and German artillery fire on likely evacuation routes. Soviet wounded sometimes waited hours or even days for medical attention. Soviet field hospitals operated at capacity, with surgeons working continuously on most serious cases while less seriously wounded waited. Soviet medical supplies were adequate for planned operations, but were strained by higher than anticipated casualties. Many Soviet wounded died from lack of timely medical care, who could have been saved with immediate treatment. German medical situation was even worse. German medical supplies were exhausted. German medical personnel were overwhelmed. German evacuation capabilities had collapsed as vehicles and fuel became unavailable. German wounded often could not be evacuated at all and remained in frontline positions, receiving minimal care. German field hospitals lacked basic supplies, including anesthetics, plasma, and antibiotics. German surgeons performed amputations and other emergency procedures with whatever supplies remained, sometimes operating without anesthesia because none was available. Many German wounded died from infections that could have been treated with adequate medical supplies. German medical disaster at Seelow Heights reflected broader collapse of German logistics and industrial capacity in final months of war. The artillery duel at Seelow Heights, while overshadowed by massive Soviet artillery barrage, demonstrated German artillery's continued effectiveness despite being outnumbered approximately 20-1. German artillery concentrated fire on Soviet assembly areas and crossing points, attempting to disrupt Soviet offensive before it fully developed. German counter-battery fire targeted Soviet artillery positions, attempting to silence Soviet guns. German artillery doctrine emphasized accuracy and fire discipline, with each shell fired at specific target rather than area bombardment. However, German artillery's effectiveness was limited by severe ammunition shortages. German artillery units were rationed to specific numbers of shells per day, often fewer than 10 rounds per gun. This meant German gunners had to make every shot count, firing only when targets were identified clearly and chance of hit was high. Soviet air superiority at Seelow Heights was complete and overwhelming. Soviet Air Force committed approximately 7,500 aircraft to support offensive, including fighters, ground attack aircraft, and bombers. Soviet fighters swept German aircraft from skies during offensive, engaging few remaining Luftwaffe aircraft and shooting down most of those that attempted operations. Soviet ground attack aircraft, particularly Il-2 Sturmovik, attacked German positions with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. Soviet bombers struck German supply lines and reserve positions. German Luftwaffe, by April 1945, was shadow of its former strength. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Pilot losses had eliminated most experienced aircrews. German aircraft remaining in service were often obsolete types that stood no chance against superior Soviet aircraft. Luftwaffe made occasional appearances at Seelow Heights but could not influence battle's outcome. The psychological warfare aspects of Seelow Heights deserve attention. Soviet forces used loudspeakers to broadcast propaganda to German positions, promising good treatment for those who surrendered and warning of certain death for those who continued fighting. Soviet psychological warfare was partially effective. Some German soldiers, particularly Volkssturm members and exhausted veterans, did surrender or desert. However, many German soldiers distrusted Soviet promises after years of propaganda about Soviet atrocities. Nazi authorities also conducted psychological operations, threatening death for deserters and families of deserters, emphasizing duty and honor, and spreading false information about miracle weapons that would turn the war around. German psychological operations were less about convincing soldiers to fight and more about terrorizing them into compliance. The role of German officer corps at Seelow Heights reflected tensions within Wehrmacht during final months. Professional officers recognized that war was lost and that continuing to fight was prolonging catastrophe. However, officers who expressed defeatism risked execution by Nazi Party officials or SS. Some officers fought at Seelow Heights because military professionalism demanded they execute orders regardless of strategic situation. Other officers fought because they believed protecting Germany from Soviet advance was moral duty even if war was lost. Some officers privately opposed continuing war but publicly maintained discipline and led their men competently. Few officers in April 1945 believed in Nazi ideology anymore, but most continued fighting from combination of duty, fear of punishment, and determination to protect their soldiers and Germany from what they believed would be Soviet retribution. The Soviet soldiers fighting at Seelow Heights represented diverse motivations and experiences. Many were veterans of years of brutal Eastern Front combat who wanted nothing more than to see war end with Soviet victory. These veterans fought with skill and determination, but also with war weariness and desire to survive final battles. Younger Soviet soldiers, particularly those from recently liberated territories or from Central Asian republics, had less personal investment in war, but fought because military discipline required it and because patriotic duty demanded it. Some Soviet soldiers were motivated by revenge for German atrocities committed during occupation. Others fought because they believed in communist ideology and Soviet Union. Most fought because they were soldiers following orders, advancing when ordered to advance, fighting when ordered to fight, and dying when circumstances required it. The logistics of Seelow Heights offensive demonstrated Soviet mastery of large-scale military logistics. Moving over 1 million troops, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces to assembly areas required coordinating thousands of supply convoys. Soviet logistics personnel calculated fuel requirements, ammunition expenditures, food consumption, medical supplies needed, and replacement requirements. Soviet railways moved supplies from factories and depots across Soviet Union to forward depots near Oder River. Soviet trucks moved supplies from forward depots to frontline units. Soviet logistics system was inefficient by Western standards, consuming resources at rates American or British logisticians would have considered wasteful. However, Soviet logistics worked because Soviet Union had resources to waste, and because Soviet logistics personnel were willing to accept inefficiency as price of getting job done. The environmental impact of Seelow Heights battle was severe. 3 days of concentrated artillery fire and tank operations devastated landscape. Forests were destroyed by shell fire and subsequent fires. Fields were cratered and poisoned by explosives. Villages were demolished. Water sources were contaminated. Wildlife was killed or driven away. The battlefield remained dangerous for years after war ended due to unexploded ordnance buried in soil. Environmental cleanup required decades, and some areas remained hazardous long after war ended. Modern environmental assessment suggests that some areas of Seelow Heights battlefield still contain soil contamination from military chemicals and explosives residue. The civilian population in Seelow Heights region suffered terribly during battle. German civilians had been warned of Soviet advance, and many had fled westward. However, large numbers of civilians remained, either because they could not arrange transport, because they believed Nazi propaganda promising German victory, or because they were unwilling to abandon homes and property. These civilians found themselves trapped in combat zone as Soviet offensive began. Many were killed by artillery fire that made no distinction between military and civilian targets. Soviet forces, upon occupying German territory, committed widespread atrocities against German civilian population, including mass rape, murder and looting. German civilians' fears about Soviet occupation, stoked by years of Nazi propaganda, but also based on legitimate concerns about retribution, were realized in ways that created lasting trauma for survivors. The Battle of Seelow Heights influenced post-war geopolitical settlement significantly. Soviet capture of Berlin, enabled by Seelow Heights breakthrough, ensured that Soviet Union would occupy eastern Germany and impose communist government. Western Allies' decision not to compete for Berlin meant that city would be divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones. This division of Berlin and Germany more broadly created conditions for Cold War tensions that would define international relations for next 4 decades. Seelow Heights, by enabling Soviet capture of Berlin, was therefore significant not just for ending World War II, but for shaping post-war world order. The military innovations demonstrated at Seelow Heights would influence post-war military thinking. Soviet tactics combining massive artillery preparation with coordinated tank infantry assaults became template for Soviet military doctrine during Cold War. NATO military planners studying Seelow Heights concluded that stopping Soviet conventional attack would require nuclear weapons, because conventional forces could not withstand Soviet mass and firepower. German defensive tactics at Seelow Heights, particularly use of terrain and defense in depth, influenced Western defensive planning for potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Tank design continued evolving based on lessons from Seelow Heights, with emphasis on firepower, armor protection, and mobility balance. The commemoration of Seelow Heights in Russia and Germany reflects different national memories of war. Soviet and later Russian commemoration emphasizes Seelow Heights as final barrier before Berlin victory. Soviet propaganda during and after war depicted Seelow Heights as triumph of Soviet military art and socialist system over fascist aggression. Modern Russian commemoration continues this tradition while acknowledging casualties in more honest way than Soviet propaganda allowed. Russian memory of Seelow Heights honors soldiers who fought and died in final weeks of war to end Nazi Germany. German remembrance of Seelow Heights is more complicated, acknowledging bravery of German soldiers who fought there while recognizing that they were defending Nazi regime that bore moral responsibility for war. German memory emphasizes tragedy of lives wasted in final battles, defending unwinnable position for morally bankrupt cause. The Battle of Seelow Heights demonstrated that final battles of wars can be as intense and costly as earlier engagements, despite war's outcome being essentially decided. German forces at Seelow Heights fought with determination despite knowing war was lost. Soviet forces attacked with overwhelming force despite anticipating victory. Both sides paid terrible price in final 3 days of major combat on Eastern Front. This pattern of intensive final battles has appeared in other wars, suggesting that even when war's outcome is known, Final fighting remains brutal because defenders fight for survival and honor, while attackers fight to end war quickly and decisively. The memory of individual soldiers at Seelow Heights deserves preservation. German soldier Werner M., age 17, a Hitler Youth member, was killed by Soviet artillery on April 16, defending position he had held for less than 48 hours. Soviet tanker Alexei R., age 23, survived 3 years of war from Stalingrad to Seelow Heights, only to be killed by Panzerfaust on April 18, while his tank attempted to advance up escarpment. German veteran Franz K., age 38, a World War I veteran who thought he would never see combat again, was conscripted into Volkssturm and killed on April 17. Soviet infantry sergeant Ivan P., age 25, led his squad through multiple attacks before being killed by machine gun fire on April 19, the day Soviet forces finally broke through. These individual stories, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, represent human cost of Seelow Heights. The Battle of Seelow Heights reminds us that war's end does not come without final struggles and sacrifices. 40,000 guns firing simultaneously created hell on earth for soldiers of both sides. German defenders fought desperately, knowing they were defending dying regime in hopeless situation. Soviet attackers advanced under fire, knowing victory was near, but that survival was not guaranteed. 3 days, 190,000 casualties combined, road to Berlin opened, Nazi Germany's final days beginning. This was how World War II in Europe approached its end. Not with quiet surrender, but with final massive battle that demonstrated war's horror even at moment of liberation and victory. The soldiers of Seelow Heights, regardless of nationality or cause, deserve remembrance for their courage in face of death and their sacrifice in war's final chapter. The 40,000 guns of Seelow Heights represent more than just military statistics. They represent industrial capacity, logistical achievement, and determination to end war decisively. Soviet ability to concentrate such massive artillery force at single point, supply it with millions of shells, and coordinate its fire effectively demonstrated that Soviet Union had become military superpower capable of projecting overwhelming force. German inability to match or counter this artillery concentration demonstrated that Germany had lost not just this battle, but entire war. The artillery barrage at Seelow Heights was simultaneously triumph of Soviet military-industrial complex and death knell of Third Reich. When those 40,000 guns fell silent after 3 days of continuous fire, Nazi Germany had only days left before final collapse. The sound of those guns firing on April 16, 1945, was sound of World War II in Europe, ending with thunder of artillery rather than whimper of surrender. That thunder echoed across Europe and into history as a reminder that even war's final moments exact terrible price from those who fight them.